Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to using Section 108 as a financing tool with low-income housing tax credit deals. My name is Jessica, and I'd like to just provide you with a few housekeeping notes. All participants will be muted during this webinar, and if you have any questions, we ask for you to use the chat feature, and then we'll respond accordingly. I'd like for you to know that this session will also be recorded, and the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation will be available within a week or so. And once that becomes available, we will send you an email to let you know that you can retrieve those materials. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Karen, who will announce and introduce the presenters for today's webinar. Karen?
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to also welcome you to this webinar about using HUD's Section 108 program as a source of financing with the low-income housing tax credit. My name is Karen Prupizny. I am the Managing Director of Special Initiatives at National Equity Fund, and we have a great panel here for you today that is going to be presenting this webinar to you, which I will introduce in a minute. LIHTC, by the way, was asked by HUD to pull together this training to highlight the Section 108 program, which they would like to see utilized by more CDBG grantees. We at NEF do not see this used as much with the tax credit program, and so part of this webinar is just allowing people to understand how this can be used and to give people access to thinking about it as a source when they are working with developers to put together financing for a local tax credit development. We worked with HUD to obtain a couple of case studies, and doing that interviewed the city about their projects and also talked to the developers. So during this webinar, we're going to give an overview of the Section 108 guarantee program, the process for applying for that, how to use it with a tax credit transaction, some of the things to think about and consider. And then we are presenting several case studies. So we have a case study from the city of High Point, North Carolina, and another from the city of Sacramento in California. And I also have a short discussion of a project that was done in Kansas City, Missouri. So assisting with the webinar today, I've got Jim Beechler, who's president of JMB Preservation Advisors. He provides technical support on affordable housing and community development strategies to city and state agencies and developers. He's been also assisting local governments implement their CDBG DR recovery efforts and has a great background and has helped us a lot as we worked through this seminar, especially on all the CDBG issues. He has 35 years of housing experience, including having worked with Rhode Island Housing Finance Agency and with Fannie Mae as Director of Partnership Investments. We also have with us Michael McNair, who is the Director of Community Development and Housing at the City of High Point, who will be helping us with the case study, discussion of the use of Section 108 for a project in his location. And joining us later, who is not yet on, will be Victoria Johnson, who's Assistant Director of Development at the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency as we discussed the Sacramento case study. Joey Bayetti is also on here, and he is the Community Development and Planning Specialist at HUD who works on the Section 108 program and will assist us with any technical questions as things go along. And then we are assisted here today by Jessica Boykin and Madeline Fraser-Clark, who are at LIHTC's national office, and are working with us and helping us in the background. One of the things I do want to point out is that we'll go through this overview and then we'll stop for some questions. So please put your questions in chat, and Jessica will help to read those out to us. We will then stop for questions again after the first case study, and then again at the very end after the second case study. So feel free, again, to put your questions at chat at those point in time, knowing that we've got 3 different points that you can request, and we will stop to answer questions. So with that, I'm going to pass the screen on to Jim to begin with the overview of the 108 program. Next slide, please. So Jessica, next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I wanted to start by giving an overview of the Section 108 program. CDBG grantees can have direct access to the program. Non-entitlement communities can access the Section 108 program through the state. And as far as businesses and nonprofits, they can partner with the local government or state entitlement depending upon the nature of their project. The projects must meet the national objective requirements of the CDBG program. Those include LMI benefits, and that is defined in the case of rental housing of having at least 51% of the tenants served to have incomes at or less than 80% of median income. In the case of the case studies at hand, using low-income housing tax credits, that is well and exceed that requirement is exceeded for in the case of the Avondale Trace and others. They meet the low-income housing tax credit program, which is 60% of median income. Additionally, the other national objective requirements include elimination of slums and blight and urgent need. As mentioned, the LMI requirement for these case studies are the low and moderate income housing. Next slide, please. Grantees must pledge their CDBG funds to secure the Section 108. So in essence, there's a pledge of future CDBG funds that may be received by the grantees. Additional collateral, such as a lien on the real estate of a property, or alternatively, a pledge of city and or other grantees, it could be a county or a state entitlement, that would pledge collateral to the extent that that was determined appropriate for a particular transaction. In addition, a grantee needs to propose a financially feasible transaction, and the Section 8 leverage capability is 5 times the most recent allocation of CDBG funds of a particular grantee. Next slide, please. Section 108 loans can be used for multiple purposes. We're talking specifically about housing in this webinar. In addition to housing, can be used for economic development, public facilities, as well as infrastructure. For housing, new construction is generally not eligible for Section 108 funding unless the grantee, unless the developer is a community-based development organization and is active in a community economic development project. For the purposes of this webinar, the suggestion is working with a field office, a HUD field office, to the extent that one is looking to define their project as a community economic development project. So we're not going to talk about that in great detail today, but that would be something that work in conjunction with the HUD field office. It relates to an overall economic development effort, including creation and maintenance of jobs in a community. Housing rehabilitation activities are also allowable in Section 108 transactions. Alternatively, Section 108 funds can be used for infrastructure, site acquisition, and demolition and relocation costs if the project work is performed by a public entity. In the case of the City of High Point, that will be discussed in greater detail. The city was the party that acquired the land and, in turn, initiated the installation of the site improvements on the property. Next slide, please. Process of applying for HUD Section 108 guaranteed loan. First of all, it needs to be established that it's eligible for 108 funds, and that includes the national objective, eligible activity, and public benefit standards. In the case studies that we're talking about today, the criteria is the low and moderate income housing, as discussed previously. In addition, all local approvals need to occur as part of the process of applying for a HUD Section 108 program. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Mike McNair and others will talk about that as part of their presentations. Section 108 applications need to be coordinated with the local field office of HUD. Initially, it's suggested that you talk about that early on in the project. Ultimately, applications are submitted to both the field office as well as to the HUD national offices. In addition, the HUD mandated requirement for environmental review as 24 CFR Part 58 is part of any real estate project that would be using Section 108 funds. And by the way, that may be in addition to the environmental reports that otherwise are required by the first mortgage lender for the transactions. Next slide, please. Funding for HUD Section 108 guaranteed loans. The loan term is up to 20 years. The initial loan is funded using a variable rate facility, and that facility is based upon the 3-month LIBOR plus 20 basis points as far as the pricing goes. And just for current information, I looked it up. Today's 3-month LIBOR rate is 21 basis points. So 21 plus 20 would be a 41 basis point cost for the interim facility. Though also 1 year ago, that same interest rate was set at the 3-month LIBOR was 1.91. So it's something that changes ultimately depending upon the markets. Upon aggregation of the sufficient size of Section 108 portfolio, HUD arranges to sell obligations with serial maturities that are guaranteed by the Section 108 program. And for those of you that have worked with state housing finance agencies active in the multifamily arena, it's not unlike those agencies that fund the individual transactions using state agency funds and then aggregate them with a larger bond issue later on. In this case, HUD does a similar type of execution. And the bond market sale is based on the HUD guarantee. And the rates are fixed based upon the market conditions. A recent transaction that was done in March of 2019 included an issue for $327 million, to give an example of that process. Next slide, please. And Karen is going to handle this section.
So can Section 108 loans be used in helping to finance a low-income housing tax credit project? So yes, but as you can see by having heard Jim talk about what 108 can be used for, you have to make sure it's structured in the right way. So what we have found by looking at our case studies is that many grantees have used the 108 loan to provide additional gap financing to their tax credit project. So, and they have really worked with HUD to make sure that it meets all the requirements that were just discussed. You'll see in our case studies that actually the developers on the projects were all for-profit developers. And two of the deals we're looking at were new construction. So what you've heard is that that's not generally a allowable use. Those things together don't really work, but the way to make it work is that the grantee can use Section 108 funds in order to, as Jim said, acquire a site or do improvement work. They complete that work, and then they can then transfer that completed work to the low-income housing tax credit partnership. And so then they can then add that to their basis for their credits and make it as part of the project. If it was a CDBO, that would be different, but for for-profit, those are the case studies. We'll go through kind of how that was structured. And it can definitely be used to pay the costs for rehabilitating residential structures. And one of our case studies is about Kansas City and how they were able to use a Section 108 facility in order to provide funding directly to a project with a historic rehab of an old school. And in that case, they were able to provide some a first mortgage debt directly to the project to pay for construction. Next slide, please. So there's a couple things, though, that really need to be taken into consideration when you, as a grantee or a developer, are really looking at utilizing this facility so that you're thinking about this in advance. So a couple things to consider are one is really big, the approval of the timeframes. As everyone knows, when you're applying for the low-income housing tax credit, it's a very competitive process, and that can often take a couple rounds. And when you get the credit, some states have specific requirements for readiness points that you have to be able to start construction at a specific time. So I think looking at those timelines against the timeline of obtaining the Section 108 loan approvals. So working with HUD to put in the application, working through your local city, approving that, getting the collateral together, all has to be worked on together. So I think the developer and the city and HUD really need to coordinate and talk about what that project is and the timeline for that, and making sure that in your state, as you're applying for credits, that this works well with the timing for getting the Section 108 loan approvals. Another thing to really consider is repayment. So as Jim said, every grantee will have to pledge future CDBG allocations towards the repayment of these facilities. You can also use funds that come from the property for which the loan is being provided to. However, most tax credit projects are structured to have very little cash flow because we have very low rents. Any cash flow is most likely going to that first mortgage that's on the property. So do not expect a large reliance on repayment from that specific project, and each grantee and city needs to acknowledge the fact that there will be a pledge of future CDB allocations to help to make these payments back on this 20-year loan or other non-project revenue that you might have. The other thing to really be thinking about in advance is the collateral. So every project will be different in a discussion with HUD about what collateral is needed in addition to the pledge of the CDBG funds. So in some cases that may be, as Jim said, a first mortgage lien on a project. In some cases it may be a lien position on other property that the city may own. So each of that has to be discussed on a deal-by-deal basis based on that transaction. All of this is doable, and I think you'll see for the 3 case studies that we'll be presenting to you that each location is thought about this a little bit differently and put this into play a little bit differently. So I think you'll get some good ideas about how this can be utilized. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. We just want to see if there are any questions at this point about the Section 108 Guaranteed Loan Program and the basics on that. Jennifer and Jessica, any questions that you're getting?
Oh, yes, you have several questions. The first question is, how much of the development entity does the CHOTO have to own? Typically, I see CHOTOs with only 1% interest on GP, with the other 99% owned by the investor LP interest.
Jim, I'm going to throw that one at you.
I think the the question is one of structuring of the general partnership interest, and in many respects, I don't believe there is a specific criteria that would disallow varied arrangements as far as HUD goes. Ultimately, I think it's going to be a question of the first mortgage lender and the equity provider. At least that's would be my sentiment on that.
Could I weigh in on that one?
Yes.
That's actually driven by the IRS and the state's QAP. The developer cannot own more than 0.01, I think, % of the project. The rest of it is really flowing through the investors. So you'll see that where the developer has just enough to say, yes, I'm a partial owner, but that's generally the formula. I think it's 0.01%.
And Jim, how about like for using the 108 for new construction, because if the developer is a community-based development organization, that's, I believe, different than a, so if they're at least 50% of the developer, then the entities, general partner entity, could the 108 monies go directly to the project? Is that sufficient enough? And I don't have the answer to that question. We may have to come back to people on that.
Okay. So another question is, when you state the grantee must pledge CDBG funds to secure the Section 108, do you mean that they forego funding for other items that year? So essentially, you wouldn't be able to grant funds out to multiple organizations for the CDBG calendar year, rather use strictly towards the Section 108 loan for development.
Right. So you are pledging future CDBG allocations that are coming to the city. That is correct. And there is a note that for each project that will line out exactly how much has to be paid back for principal. And if you do not have another source of repayment, like cash flow from the project or other city funding that's coming through, then yes, you are basically pledging your future CDBG allocations. But note that you will be able to plan for that because you get a schedule up front. On the Sacramento deal that we're looking at, the amount of their future CDBG allocation going to repay this note, if they do not get any other sources to do that, would be about, an average is about 16% of that total allocation, if their CDBG allocation remains the same it was in 2020. So you can definitely plan that out, and it is definitely something that you need to take into consideration as you're moving forward.
Okay. Another question is, can we use Section 108 for environmental cleanup of a future low-income housing tax credit home multifamily project?
I'll take that, Karen. I believe that would fit the criteria of site-related work that needed to be done in order to do a housing development. So I believe that is something that would fit.
Okay.
Or that you would have to actually have a project.
Okay.
In other words, they're not going to fund you if you don't have an approved project.
Right.
So you could do that, but it has to be part of the whole tax credit development project, not just the project to be.
Okay, want to move on to the next question? There's several questions. Okay, so this next one, I have seen Section 8 used in low-income housing tax projects for acquisition of property for conversion to affordable housing, where the developer was a nonprofit and the funding was based through form the grantee. Is that not allowed now? You mean through from the grantee? Is that not allowed?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. As the makeup of, this is a question about the makeup of what I call the general partner in a partnership. But if the question is, can a nonprofit serve as a general partner ultimately in a Section 108 transaction that also uses tax credits, I believe the answer is it can. There's nothing that would preclude it.
Correct.
Okay. Another question. Can property be acquired by a nonprofit for a future housing project with Section 108 funds?
But yes, 108 funds can be used for site acquisition without an issue, but again, but you would need to have a specific project in mind that's moving forward. So I don't believe you can use it just to acquire a site and not have a specific project that's moving forward for their financing, as Michael has stated.
Okay. Next question. These are only for non-entitlement communities, correct?
The funding can be used by both entitlement as well as non-entitlement.
Okay. You may get into the business terms later, but will HUD entertain amortization periods for 30 to 35 years?
Did you say amortization period?
Uh-huh.
That would be a question that I think you'd have to work out with the HUD field office as well as national office. It gets to, and I know we're going to be talking about that, it's specific to case studies, but it has to do with the underwriting of the transaction. And ultimately, if it's determined that it's a financially feasible transaction, that it could move forward. If there are questions about the feasibility, then that could be problematic for the developer.
Okay, we can move on.
Okay, so I think, Jim, we're going to go to the first case study, which I think will be helpful for everyone to hear about how an actual deal is put together.
Next slide, please.
Okay.
Next, this is a picture that Mike McNair forwarded of about a week ago. So as you can see, it's well on the way to being completed. The target date being the end of the year. Next slide, please. Avondale Trace Apartments is a 72-unit development for families with rents set at 40 to 60% of median income. So the population would be tenants that have incomes at or less than 60% of median income. Property includes a clubhouse, playground, and picnic area. Received 9% low-income housing tax credits from the state of North Carolina through the Housing Finance Agency. The capital stack includes a first mortgage from a conventional lender, second mortgage financing through the state of North Carolina, through the North Carolina Rental Production Program, the Section 108 loan, a North Carolina Workforce Housing Loan, and deferred developer fee, as well as equity from the sale of the low-income housing tax credits. The Section 108 loan was used by the city to acquire the land and pay for the site improvements. By the way, this is the fourth transaction that the city of High Point has completed, the first being back in 2013, as Mike McNair may further describe. Needless to say, they have been a bit of a trailblazer in this type of execution using tax credits and Section 108 funds. Next slide, please. This is the development cost and permanent financing capital structure. highlight the amount of funds they received from the state, as well as the $650,000 Section 108 loan, coupled with about $7.5 million for a total of a $10.5 million project. So in essence, the leverage of this from the must-pay debt, if you will, the $1,028,000, and the balance of the transaction is about 10% of the total. So it's a substantially, a low mortgage amount, which is not atypical for low-income housing tax credit transactions, but nonetheless shows a huge leveraging of resources there. Next slide, please. And Mike McNair will cover the motivation from the standpoint of the city in doing this execution.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to get out of sequence a little bit and start out by saying our greatest motivation in pursuing this was to mitigate the affordable housing deficit in our community. Our housing market analysis in our con plan identified that the cost burdens was a primary housing needs. We used home funds on our first tax credit, so we actually completed 5. So we did 4 with Section 108 and 1 with home. And we did that, I guess you can say hindsight's 20/20 looking back on it. We had several proposals that were not approved at our council, so we had to kind of regroup and decide what are they telling us, how do we respond to that? So we decided, first of all, that the first project would be an elderly project with the rationale that nobody's afraid of the elderly as opposed to multifamily. And then that was to minimize the NIMBY effect. It was also helpful to demonstrate that we could actually get one done when we began to talk to HUD later about doing Section 108. You could point to one on the ground as opposed to speaking, possibilities. One of the things that you need to know is that different projects require different amounts. You saw we put $650 in Avondale. We had another project we had to put $2 million in it, Section 108, because of the extensive site work requirements. There was literally a building buried in the dirt that had to be dug up and excavated from the site. But overall, our lifetime to date leverage ratio has been about 8-to-1. I would also like to share with you that one of the things that you have to be aware of is that the debt service that a project can generate is set by a formula that's provided by the state. And so, as you probably heard earlier, they don't generate a lot of money, and it's possible if they have a year where there's a lot of repairs that they have to be done, you could actually find yourself not receiving a payment because you're literally borrowing the money from HUD, lending the money to the tax credit. And you're in the middle, you're answerable to HUD. So if the tax credit for some reason can't pay you, you have to be prepared to pay HUD. And that's just something you want to keep in the back of your mind, is that you're the one that's guaranteeing the HUD. So you're the guy in the middle. And I think that's all I wanted to cover on that, Jim. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Next slide, please. This slide basically shows the information related to the City of High Point, their 2020 CDBG allocation, which is a little over $939,000. A 5-to-1 leverage capability is about $4.7 million. As you can see, the Avondale Trace gap loan in this for the project was $650, and the cumulative 108 total is the amount for all of the varied projects that the city has done using the 108 Section 108 loan execution. And the units here, as mentioned previously, 72 units, and the cumulative units created using the Section 108 execution is 298. Next slide, please. There's some loan structuring considerations that need to be carefully considered in putting this together. The rental housing funding for CDBG, as we've talked about before, is restrictive. The restrictions on direct funding of of for-profit developers, you really need to carefully structure the Section 108 loans to the partnership, how that works, the timing, and related considerations. And as has been discussed, the specific provisions for acquisition, site clearance, and site improvements with the municipal partner, the specific citation for that is included on this slide for those of you that may want to reference it at a later date. Next slide, which I believe Mike McNair will also handle.
Thank you, Jim. One thing I need to point out on this slide is normally when we're preparing to do a Section 108 application, we incorporate it within our normal action planning process so that we can get those public hearings out of the way before we start talking about the action plan. In this particular, Avondale Trace was a bit of an anomaly because we had a council meeting canceled right in the middle of our process, and it threw us off, and we were unable to give the developer a commitment letter in time for him to submit to North Carolina Housing Finance. So what we all agreed to do was, with the state, was that we would come in after the state had completed a certification process, and you'll see that's why the application actually starts in October of 2018, even though we approved the site in 2017. One of the things that we do to try to minimize, I guess, NIMBYism, is we ask the developer, we look at the developer and say, well, you're the subject matter expert. You can find sites that win. Find us sites for us to choose from, and then we'll tell you which one that we can agree with. And that is a sort of a formula that evolved over time that we had to be sensitive to the reality of communities on the ground. And essentially, we told them to try to be the next apartment complex. Try not to go next to a single-family neighborhood or something like that. Things that kind of minimize the pushback. And recently, the state, well, I guess the last 5 or 6 years, the poverty rate has been a driving factor. They had a preference for sites that were in low poverty areas, which automatically creates that pushback. So it's kind of can be kind of difficult. But one of the things that you'll see as we go through this, that typically from when you actually start your public hearing and your application, you can generally get these things done in about 6 months. So I don't want you to get the impression that, oh wow, this is a very elongated process. We'll have to own that one. We were delayed getting started. But we can see the different components. We have the application. We have to do our citizen participation plan. We have to do a substantial amendment. Of course, we have to do the environmental review. And you want to do all that outside of your regular action planning process because you don't want to come to council with 2 public hearings on the same night. And they're like, well, which plan are we talking about? So we try to keep those separate and complete it generally in the March, April timeframe. We come to council in May for the action plan. Next slide, please. So again, this is kind of rolling it out. You can see from actually the time we had our public hearing to the time that we submitted the environmental review to HUD. Well, HUD actually approved it in April of that year. So that was about 5 months between us actually starting our public hearing process completing the application and submitting it, then approved it, 5, 6 months later. So you can do it within that time frame. And then, of course, before any funds are released, they want to see the environmental reviews, and they want to see, an award from the state for tax credits. Yeah, I think that's all I got on that one, Jim. I think you're next.
Next slide, please. Couple things we wanted to cover on both the construction period as well as the follow-up slide to this one, which is after the bond sale. The phase during the construction period includes the site acquisition and site improvement. And as mentioned previously, there's a variable rate facility that's used based upon the 3-month LIBOR plus 20 basis points. Also, there is an origination fee that is updated periodically by HUD in the Federal Register for all Section 108 loan applications, or executions rather. And in the case of the City of High Point, the Avondale Trace project was 2.23%. And that is used to offset the cost of issuance of HUD during the bond sale process, as well as credit risk that may be evident as part of the overall portfolio of 108 loans. The source of capital is, as mentioned, money market funds, and require quarterly payment of interest and an annual payment of principal. Security for the loan, which is the same during the construction period in Avondale Trace, as well as the after bond sale period, include a pledge of the first mortgage on the site improvements, a pledge of future CDBG funds, and the best faith effort in the case of the City of High Point to secure repayment from general funds to the extent that there's a shortfall and an inability to pay the periodic payments. Next slide, please. And this follows the terms for the property after the bond sale. In this instance, instead of variable, it's fixed interest rate, and as described earlier, it's an aggregation of all Section 108 loans, and the bond market costs are associated with the 20-year facility specific to the remaining terms of the individual project. So it's not as though there's a scheduled bond sale every 6 months or every year. It's an aggregation of projects based upon the use of the Section 108 program, and thereafter a bond sale. The most recent, I believe most recent, or at least one that was done in 2019, March of 2019, the varied tranches had interest rates anywhere from 1 year 2.55 to 19-year tranche of 3.63. And I think the interest rates on those are blended and ultimately provided to the varied participants in the Section 108 program. Anyways, the security is the same, and the payment is semi-annual of principal and interest. Next slide, please. As far as a developer and the loan considerations for the individual project, has to do with a tremendous need for affordable housing for affordable rental housing in the city. In the case, there's a solid market for the property based upon demographics and other considerations. The underwriting is spearheaded by the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, who underwrites the project for both the sizing of low-income housing tax credits as well as the secondary debt that we that was discussed earlier. HUD, needless to say, underwrites the project for viability, as does the first mortgage lender. In this case, it was determined for Avondale Trace that the low rents and superior market for the housing development made financial sense for all the parties involved. The city loan is 2% interest only with a 20-year term and a balloon payment for the balance of the loan at that point in time that may be evident. In addition, there was strong support by City Council, the mayor, and the city manager in agreeing to pledge the general fund of the city for the property and the overall execution. Next slide, please. Some conclusions about the Section 108 for the Avondale Trace project. The first one is just the sizable amount of leverage that was available with a $650,000 loan for the development. It attracted a sizable amount of equity and other resources for the community. In addition, it's important to have a competent developer work on the transaction to orchestrate all of the various and complex processes that need to be orchestrated, both from a construction standpoint, but needless to say, from a financing side with the varied sources of financing. I do want to recognize Craig Stone of Wynwood Properties, who was extremely cooperative in discussing the 108 process from his perspective and led us to some valuable insights about his perspective of this. Also the first Section 108, and Mike didn't talk about this that much, but the first one was certainly a leader as far as paving the way to subsequent successes that they've had using the Section 108 program from a process standpoint internally within the city, as well as working with the HUD and the development partners in the community. And then finally, the support of as mentioned, the support of the local leaders was very much critical to the successful rental housing development goals as evidenced by this project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen.
I think at this point, we're going to see if there's any questions on this Avondale project. Jessica, any questions you're seeing?
I have a couple of questions, but before the questions, can I ask everybody to please make sure that they are muted, they're not speaking, and everybody, all the attendees, to please mute themselves. One question we had was, what is the City of High Point source of repayment of their Section 108 loan? Will it be repaid from property cash flow or when the property is refinanced?
We budget the repayment in our action plan as a CDBG payment. And if we have insufficient funds, our city makes up the difference in general fund.
This question is in a similar situation to what Michael described, where the tax credits were coming in slower than anticipated to take out the Section 108. HUD considered refinancing the 108 loan with a new Section 108 loan. Luckily, that wasn't needed. But would that work?
Joey might have to speak to that. I can't imagine. My understanding is that we're on the hook. So we are prepared to fill any gaps that have to be filled.
These questions, what we'll do is we'll make sure that the presenters get them and ensure that everybody has an answer to all the questions that are posed on the chat. You can continue, Karen, please.
Okay. So next question is the case study on Mirasol Village redevelopment, which is located in Sacramento, California. Next slide, please. Mirasol Village is it's a multi-phase transformation of the prior Twin Rivers Public Housing site. This was the oldest public housing site owned by the Housing Authority of the County of Sacramento. They worked and got a Choice Neighborhoods Award, Planning Award, to take a look at what to do with the site to make it more connected to the community and to transit transit in the city. Over time, they decided that what they would do was to tear down the old units and build 427 new units with rents ranging from 30 to 80% of the area median income. This would include one-to-one replacement of the prior 218 public housing units. It also include a public garden, a park, community space, fitness center. The developer here, which is McCormick Barron, a national for-profit developer who is known for their work in transformation projects, utilized the 4% credit to help with this project, and then worked with the various agencies with the City of Sacramento to come up with other sources of financing. Let's go to the next slide so I can kind of go through where we are with different players. So I want to talk about the players and then how the financing came in on this one. This is, as we said, a multi-phase project. It will be 4 different tax credit partnerships. So right now we're focusing in on the first one, which is currently under construction. The Housing Authority of the County of Sacramento is the one who owned the land and the prior housing units that were there. They're the ones that went for the Choice Neighborhood Award. They got a Choice Neighborhoods implementation grant as well to help them with the costs on these projects. And they are leasing the land to the developer and the tax credit partnerships. The Housing Authority of the City of Sacramento is a designated public agency that worked with the City of Sacramento to apply for the 108 financing. Both the Housing Authority of the County of Sacramento and the City of Sacramento entered into a joint powers authority agreement with the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Authority, SHRA, who really is overseeing the development on behalf of all of these different players and also overseeing the use of the 108 funds. For this project, it was determined that the 108 money would be used for infrastructure costs, for helping with some of the parks, for the roads, for utilities, and that was basically would be divided between each of the different tax credit partnerships, and then there would be an infrastructure reimbursement loan from each partnership back to SHRA, and after discussion with attorneys and accountants, was also determined that some of those infrastructure costs could be added into the tax credit basis for each project. In this case, there's the tax-exempt bond, which is provide the low-income housing tax credit proceeds. There'll be agency debt as first mortgage. The developers got state funds, the HCD, AHSC loan. And then, as you can see, there's the other money in there came from the city and from the land lease. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to ask Victoria Johnson with the City of Sacramento to talk now about the motivation and their use of 108 and go through the timeline on this project.
Good afternoon. Is my sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the redevelopment project that the Section 108 funds were used in had been conceived of many years before. The idea came up probably, I want to say, in the early 2000s, and at that time, Sacramento, among all the other California cities, had access to redevelopment funding. So in the original scenario for the project, it was expected that redevelopment funds would pay for the infrastructure improvements. Subsequently, 2011, 2012, redevelopment funding went away. It moved over to other places in the state budget. And staff had to come up with a mechanism to replace those funds. The comment that Mr. McNair made about City Council, I would say, can't be overstated, because there was a couple of years of discussion with the various City Council members to make sure that there was going to be support to use the Section 108 proceeds for this purpose. And because our city is, the members of council represent their separate geographic districts, some of the council members were less supportive than others, thinking that it was that this particular District 1 was being a little too greedy, trying to take up all the CDBG funds. So that was an important part of pre-development work, if you will, which is getting the support from all of the different council members. So the motivation, therefore, was to build the infrastructure which was going to be required. The site had originally been developed in the 40s and was very old, had to be replaced. And without the redevelopment funds, we were looking all different. There was a state program, IIG, infill infrastructure grants. We looked at a number of different options, and the Section 108 seemed to be the best fit. As Karen mentioned, we were also successful, Sacramento was also successful in participating in the HUD Choice Neighborhoods program, which was a tremendous boon, both from a dollar perspective as well as just a public acceptance and publicity perspective. So as each different source was committed, the project became more and more real, because it had been on the drawing board for almost a decade in the minds of different people in the community, recognizing that the property had to be redeveloped. And the happy ending is that we are now under construction. So we are about a year away from the first households moving back in. And next slide is talking just broadly in the same way that you saw in North Carolina. The capability of the city is to leverage the CDBG grant in proportion to the municipal allocation. In this case, we, like High Point, we had two other Section 108 grants, loans. Prior to this one, this was our third execution. The first loan was for a rental project. It was a LIHTC project, but it was a mixed income. So the plan in that instance has been successfully to repay the Section 108 loan with project proceeds from the market rate units. And the LIHTC units benefit from that as well. And the second Section 108 loan was a home ownership project where the bulk of the infrastructure was paid for with redevelopment funds, but there wasn't enough, so we also took out a Section 108 loan, and that loan is paid for with CDBG in our annual action plan. So even though in theory we had $24 million of capability, some of it was already pledged to the prior Section 108 loan, and the 16.4 was what was available to us additionally. So we've used it, just like North Carolina, in a number of different projects with slightly different structures, but overall very successfully, and I'm very satisfied with the program. Next slide. This is the same, Karen, I think you were going to really, this is similar to North Carolina?
Correct. So I think just bringing up again that this is similar, like in North Carolina, that when you are working to do new construction with the 108 program, you have to be very careful about the structuring and the uses to make sure it works correctly. So really working with your local HUD office about how to make this work out for the 108 program. And here you can see the permitted uses for use of 108 with new construction is acquisition, site clearance, site improvements as completed by the municipal partner. And in this case, SHRA is completing that work on behalf of the partnership, and that therefore could use the 108 loans for that purpose. So again, we just want to really just state that there's, and when you do new construction, to really focus in on with HUD about how to structure that and what it can be used for. being very clear to them about who your partners are and the roles of the partners that you're looking at for this transaction. Okay, next slide, which I think is on the timeline.
Yeah, and so I alluded to the timeline. It was a really long process. All of us involved in affordable housing and community development know that things take years, take a village, et cetera, just take everything, endless amounts of patience. The project conceived by different community members as far back as 2007, 8, 9. It took years to get to the point where we were able to identify which programs would be a good fit. We applied for a Choice Neighborhood Planning Grant, initially, I believe, in 2011, and were not successful, and then we applied again and were successful. So all of that was going on long before we had thought about Section 108, but that was the groundwork that needed to be laid, and the original concept was actually a different redevelopment project. The number of units, the size, the building types, all of that had originally been conceived one way but changed over time. So by the time we finally got to HUD and got our CDBG action plan approved, we had a really good idea. We already had an approved site plan. That was very, very important. The mapping process, as we know, can take years. And so we were in a pretty good state of preparedness when we finally did submit our application to HUD. And when I started working on the project was soon after that approval, and the person that handed it off to me said, Victoria, here you go, here's everything you need. You should be able to close this in a month or two. Well, it took me another year. Fortunately, if I remember correctly, Joey, we had a commitment letter that was good for, I want to say 18 months, and we actually needed the full 18 months because things that we did not expect popped up. We had some difficulty with what seems like a super simple task, finding a document custodian. U.S. Bank had been the document custodian our first two transactions, but we weren't interested this time. So even that, again, sounded like it's like the simplest thing ever, but it took me like 6 months to find a document custodian. Initially, it appeared that staff thought there was a 1-to-1 collateral requirement, but in fact, it was a 1.25 collateral requirement. So we had to hustle. I actually had to get some updated appraisals and was able to demonstrate that the value of the property did meet the 1.25. And all of that took me almost an extra year. We pulled ourselves together. We got everything submitted. Joey was infinitely patient with me as I asked the same questions over and over and over again. And we did close our transaction in December of 2019. Next slide. So we on the parallel path, our developer was putting together a series of applications for state funding, for local funding, and for tax-exempt bonds and the corresponding 4% credit. So that was all happening at the same time. It really was a great crescendo that things fell in place. We were able to close the loan, sign the contract with the underground contractor, and start the project, if you will, because the underground really was the start of the project, and get that work underway in time for the vertical construction to begin. And everything so far is happily ever after. Next slide.
Next slide. Thank you. Thanks, Victoria. So I think, so on this one, just looking at, again, the terms between the city and HUD. So these monies are being used for infrastructure costs, and the city of Sacramento is drawing them down on a phased basis as they're getting ready for each of the projects. So right now it is a variable rate facility, as Jim had discussed. On this one, the costs to the city are a 3-month LIBOR plus 20 basis points, and there's a guarantee fee here as well to HUD of 2.365%. The security, as Victoria has alluded to here, was that HUD required a pledge of the first lien position on other SHRA-owned property equal to 1.25 times the loan amount, so $21 million. And part of this was because of the fact that for this project, this loan is one of several soft financing loans, and most of the cash flow will be going to pay the agency debt. And then after that, 50% of the cash flow would go to pay developer fee, and the other 50% would be split in order of priority of the soft loans. So the state loan getting the first priority and then money going to the infrastructure loan. So while there may be some money coming from the project to here, there is not a lot, and there's not a good lien position for the loan on this property as well, due to the fact that you do have a large agency debt taking the main source of the priority lien. So on this one too, the city is pledging the future CDBG funds. Next slide, please. And that's the same security for before and after. And again, once HUD decides to pull together all the various Section 108 obligations they've got, they'll sell that on the market, and then the city will have a fixed rate. They do currently have a note that talks about, there's a variable rate, it will come a fixed rate, but they have a specific principal payment that shows payment over a 20-year period. And as I mentioned, next slide, please, by the way, that payment is averaging about 16% of the city's future CDBG allocation, ranging from 9% to 23%. And that's over, so if you look at the sense that the city gets the same CDBG allocation that it has gotten currently, that's how I looked at these as a percentage. So it's a doable percentage for the payment that still leaves the city with other funds, CDBG funds, to do other things in the future. But they know that going forward every year, there's a certain amount of those future CDBG monies that has to go to pay this loan, unless they do have some cash flow from this deal. So in terms of the developer, what they just knew is that the city was completing the infrastructure work, that they were able to allocate those funds, that work and those costs to each project. And then they have an infrastructure reimbursement note, which is at the AFR and in a subordinate position. And I think from the developer's perspective, again, they were able to apply some of that to their tax credit eligible basis. And we would basically advise any developer, as they're looking at infrastructure costs being included in basis, to work with their accountant on that to make sure that those costs are things that are includable by the IRS. Next slide. So on this one, I think what's important here is that the city was able to find the financing for the $16 million in infrastructure costs that was needed to complete this project. You have McCormick Bearing getting the tax credit financing in place, and they're also getting other soft money from the state, and they're continuing to do that as they're moving forward with the other phases. The biggest issue, is the city providing this other real estate as collateral in this case, but they were able to make that work. Though it, as Victoria talked about, took a little time and effort, but they had the ability to do that and worked with HUD to make that work. And the timing worked out on this multi-phase project. I think that, the developers were applying for the bond allocation and were able to obtain that and other soft financing. This will be more competitive going forward, as in California, the bonding authority is more competitive as well, but they already have the 108 money, and it's there and will be there as they complete phases 3 and 4 for their financing. Let me go on to the next slide. This is just a short sidebar, meaning that we don't have a full case study on the Faxon School Historic Rehab in Kansas City, Missouri, but it is one that I did want to bring up as another way that this has Section 108 funds have been used. And Kansas City has used Section 108 in multiple instances. So next slide. So what we wanted to highlight here is that the Kansas City was able to use the Section 108 program. This was in 2014, so it was a little while ago. But they were able to provide financing for a historic rehab project. So as the Faxon School was converted into 45 units of senior housing. The developer on this is a for-profit again. This these 45 units were used as replacement housing for other affordable housing units that were lost upon the demolition of another HUD finance project. And so HUD required that there be the replacement of those units, and they also were keeping a lien requirement on the replacement property. Because of that, it was difficult for the developer to find another source of perm debt. And so the city went to HUD to say, you know, we can't find another perm debt, let's consider the 108 program. And everybody agreed that that would be appropriate here. It's used for a rehab of historic project, which is an allowable use under the 108 program. And in this case, the 108 loan was put in a first priority position on this project. The loan here was structured as a 30-year amortizing loan at a market rate of interest with a 20-year term. So this was to match the city's 108 repayment obligations to HUD. So in this case, the city will be getting cash flow from this project that they can then use to help to pay their obligations back to the 108 loan obligation and the note. And they still have to pledge the CDBG, future CDBG allocations to pay this, just in case there's not enough cash flow from this property to match with what must be paid on the note that they have for their 108 obligation. This project was quite lucky in that it was able to get federal and state tax credits and also federal and state historic credits and another soft loan from the city. So in this case, over 60% of the costs are really being financed through equity or soft loans, and therefore the term loan on this one worked well under the 108 program. It's a small first mortgage. But just another way to think about how this could be used, I think this was a creative use of the 108 program to help to make this project move forward. So with that ends our 3 case studies. And we wanted to open up for questions, and especially at this point, any questions for Victoria or I about the Sacramento project?
Well, there was a question that was asked, was the city of Sacramento or High Point required to establish a loan loss revenue for HUD?
Loan loss revenue?
Loan loss reserve?
Loan loss reserve, sorry, for HUD.
No, but we did execute an agreement to pay the note. So the city was on the hook to pay the note.
Yeah, Mr. McNair had mentioned this is actually a recourse loan to, I believe, Joey can correct me, it is always a recourse loan to the jurisdiction that is the partner. So in Sacramento's case, the loan will be primarily paid back through the CDBG future entitlement. It is a recourse loan to the city should the CDBG entitlement fail to be authorized by Congress in subsequent years. And if that all falls apart, the city goes out of business, then there's the real estate collateral in the queue. So looking at it that way, there's three sources of guarantee.
Okay. Regarding construction financing, it could be structured as a jobs activity?
Okay. Repeat that one more time.
Says regarding construction financing, it could be structured as a jobs activity.
Commissioner mean jobs as in one of the CDBG allowed uses, economic development? Is that what they're referring to?
I only have what they wrote down here. So if he wants to further elaborate, he can go into the chat, and then I can get back to you guys. I'll move on to the next question. It says, HUD, this is actually from HUD, and it says, HUD does allow for refinancing Section 108 loans, but borrowers cannot simply take out a new loan to pay off an existing loan. there would have to be an there will have to be an eligible activity before a new Section 108 loan could be used. And this question here, or this comment is, given the time sensitivity, I really wondered what % of attempted projects relying on Section 108 fall apart together. Is chance of success mostly dependent on a savvy developer?
Well, I would say, well, first off, to do a tax credit project, you need a very good developer to get through that process. But I think in combining it with 108, you need a very knowledgeable city and a grantee, and I think we have two of them here that really understood how Section 108 could work and had a good rapport with their HUD office to kind of have that discussion. And I believe the same was with Kansas City. So I think the city can be the one that's savvy and think about how to use this program, which is not used a lot with the tax credits or for multifamily, and really try to be creative in doing that.
Okay.
Hello, this is Joey. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I just want to step in real quick to address a couple of questions. So just a little bit of a correction. The Section 108 loans are actually typically non-recourse loans. It seems like to the entitlement recourse because HUD does have that pledge of the current and future CDBG allocation that we can dip into if a borrower was going to miss a year of debt service. So just to address that item. And then also on the timing, as Victoria was mentioning, there are a lot of maybe littler items that need to be accomplished throughout the financing phase of the Section 108 process. And one thing to bring up is a lot of those items can actually be accomplished concurrently with the review of an application and drafting of the financing documents. So if there was a need to rush a project through, we could accomplish some of those tasks like Victoria was mentioning, gathering the collateral documentation, looking for that document custodian. A lot of those items can be done while HUD is still working through the approval process and drafting of the financing documents. Another question I think that was asked before about the structuring of the amortization schedule of the Section 108 payments. So HUD loan term on a Section 108 note cannot exceed 20 years, but we do allow for flexible amortization throughout that term. So if a project needed to have a few years of interest-only payments while they are waiting for lease-up, HUD does allow for that. So we would work with the borrower or the applicant on a repayment schedule that fits the needs of the project.
Okay, regarding that initial question on refinancing construction, Jeffrey came back and said, what I meant is instead of treating a project as new construction, it could ultimately be seen as a project creating jobs and meet Section 3 obligations too.
I can answer this one. Unfortunately, the construction jobs do not count towards an economic development project. So if you were thinking about economic development through construction, it would have to be through construction of a retail or commercial property that was then going to generate jobs.
Okay. And then there's a comment here. It says, the idea of using a new Section 108 to take out the old one came from HUD. The existing loan was still in the temporary facility at the time.
Yeah, we would probably have to look at the specific details of the project. So there, like I think I mentioned in the chat, HUD does allow for refinancing of loans if they're in the permanent rate, and we have some flexibility with refinancing, but you can't simply use a new Section 108 loan to take out an old Section 108 loan as the sole activity. So it would have to we would have to look at that project to see if there was an eligible activity that could be involved in the project.
Okay. When interest payments are due, what LIBOR or LIBOR date is used? For example, if the payment is due February the 1st, 2021, what LIBOR date was used to calculate interest? Because LIBOR changes daily.
I believe the bank uses, recalculates the interest at the first of the month.
If you're replaced really soon, Joe, you probably know when it's going to be a new index. It has to be a new index.
Yes, exactly. So we are working with the bank to identify a new index that we're going to use to replace LIBOR when it does sunset. And as soon as we identify that new rate, we're going to let all our borrowers know, and we'll release an announcement so that new users to the program will also know. But it'll be one, we're tracking different rates now, so it'll be one that's very similar to the LIBOR plus 20 basis points.
Okay, that's all the questions that I have in the chat.
All right, I believe that if you go 2 slides forward, Jessica. Towards the end, to the very last slide. Just wanted everyone, again, one more, to know that, there's the contact information. I think it would be the very last one. There we go. But this, again, this PowerPoint will be posted, and we are also working on writing up the case studies that we present here so that they can be posted as well, probably in the next week or so. And then this provides you with the contact information of the people that were on the panel in case you wanted to reach out for other questions or other resources. And I thank Victoria and Michael for assisting us today and being willing to be on the webinar and talk about their projects and how the cities, in each case, work to make this program work with their tax credit deal that they were focused on that was important to their community. With that, I think that we are done with our webinar, unless anyone else would like to add any final remarks between Jim, Victoria, Michael, or Joey.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like. Sorry, I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for participating on today's webinar, especially Victoria and Michael. I really appreciate you coming on to present your awesome projects to everyone, and I hope that everyone takes these great examples and runs with them. I did also want to say that we are going to be covering some examples of using historic tax credits as well with housing, but also with other projects. And we're hoping to add that to the Opportunity Zone webinar that's part of this webinar series. So please sign up for that one and join us there to get more information on that. And please reach out to me if you have any other questions about the Section 108 program. There were a lot of really great questions on the webinar today, and a lot of ones that are really specific and I think would really be determined based on the project. So please reach out if you have any questions about the program or if you just want to run project ideas by me. So you have my contact information there, and I'd be happy to set up a call or anything with you all. So thanks again for the participation.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks, everyone, for presenting, and thanks to Jessica for helping moderate and run the webinar. This is Madeline. I would like to also just let everybody know that we will be having the second webinar in this series on December 3rd at 1:30, and that one will be covering the use of new markets tax credits with the Section 108 program. So please feel free to join us for that one as well, and stay tuned for the write-ups of the case studies, as Karen mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.